I'm going to read from Isaiah chapter 40, verses 21 through 31. Listen to the words of the text this morning. Have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to live in, who brings princes to naught and makes the rulers of the earth as nothing. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth. When he blows upon them and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. To whom then will you compare me? Or who is my equal, says the Holy One? Lift up your eyes on high and see. Who created these? Who brings out their host and numbers them, calling them all by name, because he is great in strength, mighty in power, not one is missing. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary. Even the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the world today. Thanks be to God. Oh, hey, Children's Church, thanks. Yeah, there's that. Children are dismissed for Children's Church. Thank you. As they make their way down, I've preached Isaiah 40 before, I realized. I've preached it before. It's a beautiful passage of Scripture. There's so much happening in these verses. It is one of my favorite verses, and there are so many different ways to preach this text. But I realized this week I had a funeral for Janice Conklin, who was a longtime member of this church, just yesterday. And the last time I preached this text, I was doing research for the funeral and going through other funerals I preached. And I realized that the last time I preached this text was in May of 2018, almost 6 years ago now, at the funeral of Fred Soddy. Fred Soddy, many of you here today know Fred Soddy, and many of you here do not. I got to say, if you did not know Fred Soddy, you missed out. You missed out. Fred was, he was a pillar of this church. He was a true saint. If you want to know what a saint looks like, it was Fred Soddy. Fred, when I got here, he was a member of the board. And I remember sitting in the Bethel room, which is now our offices, where the offices are located. That was the Bethel room for one of our first board meetings. And I remember we were talking about what the mission statement of our church should be. We had thrown some ideas on the table. We had talked about it for a little bit. And Fred said slowly and deliberately, well, what if we said loving God, loving others? That seems to sum up the greatest commandments. And we kind of all looked around the room and we just knew that that's what the mission statement was going to be. Fred had spoken. Despite not being ordained, Fred was often referred to as Pastor Fred here. People called him Pastor Fred. He wasn't ordained, but his presence was pastoral. His prayers were deep. Do you guys remember how Fred would pray? Simple, but full and meaningful. I miss Fred Soddy. He was a man who was never in a hurry. He wasn't slow or late. He was deliberate, but not rushed. And I visited with Fred quite a bit, especially towards the latter years of his life. He never felt like he needed to rush the conversation. There would be periods of the visit where we would just sit in silence, and Fred was quite content to sit in the front room of his house and to watch the birds feed outside his front window. He had a lot of bird feeders, and he loved to watch the birds eat outside his bay window in the front of his house, right up on What lake is that? Right up on this lake, right up here. Leech Lake, that's it. Not a good name, but it's a good lake. You see, it wasn't that Fred was fighting against the pace of life that so many of us are experiencing. It was as if Fred just kind of told time a little bit differently. It was like he lived in a different timeline than me, at least. Very few things were urgent for Fred, especially in our visits. The last time I preached this text, I learned this week, was at the funeral of Fred Soddy. And these verses, Isaiah chapter 40, are really unique. And truly, this is an important chapter in the book of Isaiah. Because at Isaiah 40, there is a major shift in the narrative. This morning in the Nazawat class, we were talking about the scriptures. And one thing Rich Moore, longtime pastor, said is the context is everything. And that's really true. Context is everything. And understanding the context of what's happening in Isaiah 40 is paramount, because for the first 39 chapters, the author has basically been warning Israel that if they are unfaithful, guess what? If you're unfaithful, guess what? There are going to be consequences. There's going to be consequences. Israel is, there's going to be punishment that's going to come upon you if you're unfaithful. Israel has become really comfortable, and they're forsaking their first love. The prophet Isaiah warns them about this posture. Hey guys, watch out. If you're not faithful, you better watch out. That's Isaiah 1 through 39. Then in chapter 40, things shift on a dime. Immediately after chapter 39, verse 40 jumps in. Instead of warning people that they may be overrun by the Babylonians, which was the threat, the very first words of chapter 40 are this. This is how chapter 40 begins. Comfort, oh comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she served her term, that her penalty is paid, that she has received from the Lord's hand double all her sins. That doesn't sound like warning, does it? That doesn't sound like you better watch out because if you keep being unfaithful. No, what is that? What is this? Warning has become comfort. Punishment has become tenderness. Like that. The shift is so dramatic between chapter 39 and chapter 40 that it has led scholars to believe that at Isaiah 40, we are reading a completely different book written by a different author who was writing under the pseudonym of Isaiah. Israel, apparently, at chapter 40, is now in exile in Babylon. Jerusalem has been overrun, and the people have been deported to Babylon, the world's largest empire. You know the thing that the first 39 chapters talked about, warning might happen if you're unfaithful? Well, here in chapter 40, guess what? It's happened. The people have been taken captive to Babylon. And while we and the Babylonians are centuries apart, while we live on literally the other side of the world, and while we are about as culturally different from Babylon as we could be, I want to make the case today that, as foreign as she may be, Babylon might actually feel and look and sense quite familiar to us today. Babylon was the world's only superpower at the time. It was the only superpower at the time. Now, I don't know that we know ancient Near East history as well as maybe we ought, but Babylon would eventually grow to house over 150 million people in its empire, which was half of the globe's population at the time. But more than power, Babylon was the cultural, the financial, and the social center of the world. Babylon was where things happened. The World Trade Center was located in Babylon. Babylon was the world's financier. They collected gold from every corner of the empire by any means they could. And they not only exported their goods across the world, which they did, they also exported their culture across the world. Their culture would invade so many peoples around the world. They were the world's producers. They had the world's largest economy by a massive magnitude. Babylon was the production capital of the world. And to sustain their economy, they needed to keep collecting gold and keep making goods. They needed to keep collecting finances, money, and keep making more things to export. And in order to produce goods, what did they need? They didn't have AI. They didn't have machines who would operate the assembly line. What did they need? Workers. Or, I heard it from right over here, slaves. This is why Babylon would sack nations and import their people. They would take people from the surrounding nations around them, capture the city, bring the people into Babylon to make all the goods. In order to maintain production, the Babylonians, they needed people. And the Babylonians weren't going to be the ones breaking their backs doing all the labor. That's why we got foreign neighbors. We can conquer them and subdue them and bring them in to produce all our goods so that we can live pretty nicely. I don't know if any of that sounds familiar to you or not. But church, you do know that we live in our world's cultural, financial, social, and production giant, right? Our country for nearly a century has been the world's financial center. New York City is where global trade happens. We have the world's greatest economy. We are still to this day, believe it or not, we are the world's richest nation by a lot. By a lot, we are still the world's richest nation. We are like 50 to 60% more rich than China. We have the world's largest economy. The only country with more exports than us is China. Do you know why they have more exports than we do? Because we exported our exporting. Because we shipped all our exporting across the sea. Instead, we don't necessarily export a whole bunch of goods. Instead, we now export our culture throughout the world. Through movies and music, social media. We are a massive exporter. We are the social center of the world. Now, when I say this, don't hear this as necessarily a criticism, because to be frank, I'd rather it be the United States of America than Russia or China or Brazil. But I do want us to recognize that we do live in the world's center of production. We love to produce things and to make things, especially here in blue-collar Michigan, right? We're not unlike Babylon in that way. And like Babylon, in order to keep this machine running, we have to keep producing more. We have to keep making more. If our economy isn't growing, we're failing. If the bottom line isn't growing, we're failing. If the shareholders aren't happy, we're failing. This has resulted in a culture that values almost above everything else busyness and speed. When they make a new phone, how do they market it? How do they advertise it? It is what than the previous model? Faster. It is 4 times faster than the last model because I need my emails that much more quickly. Because I can't wait for that video to buffer 4 seconds. Give it to me in 2. It's faster, and guess what? Guess what I can be when I have the next technological step up? I can be more productive. Do you know how much more I can get done? Because I have a computer that sits on my lap and that connects to any internet around the world anytime I need it to, and because I can sync my phone and my tablet and my computer, I can just pick up where I left off on my previous device. The promise of email is that we can be more productive. You don't have to take the time and get a hand cramp. I don't even know if I could write a full handwritten letter. I think my hand would cramp up. Instead, we can just shoot off a bunch of short digital notes. And with AI, with ChatGPT, well, now we don't even need to write them. Now we can just go to a website, tell them what to put into the compute, put into our what we want the email to say, and it'll write it for us. Copy, paste, send. We can be so productive. We can be so productive with AI, with these AI chat models. As our technologies get faster and faster, our calendars actually get fuller and fuller, and we feel the need to produce more and more. And I don't know about you, but we kind of just find that life just keeps hitting a pace that becomes more and more unsustainable. It's just getting faster and faster, and it feels like the goal line keeps moving and moving and moving. When we feel like we've made it to the end zone, we look down, we look up, and the goalpost is further down. And the further we go, the faster we go to get there, the further it gets from us. We can never make it. We can never arrive. We're just going faster and faster and faster. I don't know. Am I alone in this? Does the world feel faster than it used to? I mean, the pace is just exhausting. The world keeps getting faster and faster, and there's always more to accomplish. There's more to produce, and it's impossible to keep up with everything. There's a theologian and a professor at Fuller Seminary named Andrew Root, at Luther Seminary now, who has written extensively on this. He says that there are 3 factors that are speeding up our world: technology, social change, and the pace of life. Now, I've already mentioned technology, but we're also living in an age with an ever-changing social structure. Socially, the world around us is changing faster than we can actually process it. Some of this social change is really, really good and important. Social change is like the recognition that persons bear the image of the image of God, regardless of skin color. Some social changes are not as good, but regardless, the reality is that the pace of social change can be incredibly disorienting. Things that we assumed together 50 years ago, just 20 years ago, are no longer true. And it feels like I don't know how to interact in this world because it keeps changing. I don't know what's an acceptable posture for me to take because it's like the ground underneath me is moving socially. And that's just hard. That's just hard. Things are speeding up in a way that many of us feel is truly unsustainable. We're not unique in that. This was true for Babylon. Babylon needed to keep producing. Babylon needed to keep growing. They needed to maintain their cultural, social, and financial dominance in the world. And they do for a very long time until Alexander the Great. And Israel was held captive to this cultural force. Quite literally. For more than one generation, they were held in bondage to the cultural, financial, and social realities of Babylon. Now listen, church. Listen, just as much as Israel was held captive to this cultural force, so is the church today held captive to the cultural, financial, and social realities of our own time and place. We too are held captive to the realities of the world around us. Here's a long quote. I want you to listen. This is a quote from Andrew Root again. He wrote, and this is heavy. He said, "The congregation must be busy in 2 ways. First, it must be busy in its offerings, programs, activities, groups, and a full schedule. People seeking fullness from busyness want to be near busyness, even if they don't really want to participate. This is deeply frustrating to pastors, children's ministers, and youth workers, but nevertheless an unavoidable result of creating a relevant, busy congregation to reach busy people. Even if such busy people don't have the time to partake themselves, they feel good knowing the church is busy, full of activities. It gives them the assurance that the church can offer them fullness when they finally carve out the time to participate. Thus, parents might not have the time to get their 13-year-old to youth group, missing every week from October to March because of basketball tournaments. Nevertheless, they expect the youth group to be vibrant and exciting, complaining by email if it wanes. When such a congregation grows, it does so by adding programs and activities at a much higher rate than participants and new members, putting undue stress on the pastoral staff." What he's saying is that the church is held captive to the ever-increasing pace of life changes in the world around us. That as our culture says we need to be more productive, we need to do more, we need to have more offerings and more things available to us, that's what we think the church needs to be too. We got to have all the programs for all the people at all times, and if we don't have it, well then we're not going to grow. As if growth is the number one metric for a faithful congregation. We, the people of God, are just as captive to the cultural realities of our world as the Israelites were to Babylon in Isaiah chapter 40. And I think we know it. I think we feel it. I think we sense it, even if we can't put it into as many words. Let me ask you, church, is anyone here today tired? Is anyone tired? Is anyone just worn out from the pace of this world? You know, the 40-hour work week was designed for one person to stay home with the kids. Is anyone here exhausted, burdened, feeling like you just can't keep up? And if you aren't feeling that, I can almost promise you don't have kids. If you have kids, well, let me put it this way. Are there any of you that aren't exhausted? Because I want to know what the secret recipe is. Because I want to know. The words of Isaiah to the Israelites in captivity to Babylon could be said of Christians in captivity to our own cultural moment. Even youths will faint and be weary. Even the young will fall exhausted. If that's not true for us today, I don't know what is. Our lives are busier than ever. And we don't hate it. We do, but we wear that busyness like a badge of honor. Hey, how are things going? Oh, I'm so busy. So busy. As if that's the best thing in the world you could be. We like to think that because our lives are busy, they are somehow full. Church, let's be careful not to equate busyness with fullness. No, busyness has become an idol. What's true is actually the opposite. The busier we become, more likely than not, that leads to more alienation. The busier we become, the more alienated we feel. You tired? You worn out? If you think that because I'm preaching this, I'm somehow exempt from this busy pace of life, I don't want to show you my January calendar. That's a confession, church. The response to this exhaustion, to this ever-increasing pace of life, to this unsustainably speeding up world we live in is usually one of two options. First, the first response is one to lean into it. Embrace that this is just the way it is. This is the world we live in. We got to live into it. Let's dive headfirst into the pace of life. Let's embrace the programs. Let's embrace the growth. Let's embrace the activities. Let's do all the things. Let's be all the things. Let's go all the places. Embrace the pace as a method for achievement. Confessionally, church, if I could be honest with you, this is where I tend to find myself. I have been called by someone in this church, a former board member, a former board secretary, a change junkie. If you think pastors are exempt from this increasing pace of life, you'd be kidding them. You'd be kidding yourself. My week was so nuts that it was 10:12 p.m. last night when the sentence I'm speaking right now was written. So the first response is to just lean in, to do all the things, to be all the things. The other option is to try to fight that, to kick against the pace. The other option is to try to slow down. Anybody here tried to slow down? Anybody always trying to slow down? And it feels like slowing down is more work than staying fast? Why? It's because we're swimming in a river that says go fast. And when you try to slow down, you're going against the current. And that's harder. But even if you stand still, it's like, I just keep going. I just keep moving. Why? Because we're swimming in it. We try to fight against the social and cultural change. Or if we're not actively fighting against it, then we're just ignoring the responsibilities of our fast-paced life in some form of rebellion. Just not even going to look at it. Not even going to look at how fast things are going. And you might think that this is the better option, that second option is better. And maybe of those two, that is the better option, but I don't know that it's the solution, because it ends up wearing us out even more. And we get fatigued from fighting against it. Because the truth is, even if you slow down the spinning mouse wheel, you're still on the mouse wheel. Even if you swim against the current, you're still in the river. No, church, what if our job, what if the role of the church, of the faithful ones to Jesus Christ, wasn't to keep up with the pace of the world around us? What if it wasn't even to kick against it and go backwards? What if the church told time differently? What if we lived according to a different clock? Jesus said, "Come to me. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you another checklist. Come to me, you who are exhausted, and I'll give you another thing to do. I will give you rest." Have you found yourself saying, "Man, we need a vacation. We're exhausted. We're tired"? Yet how often is coming to church a box on our checklist that we mark off? It's another program competing for our time with our kids' activities, with our school schedules, with our social calendars. Isaiah has a word for us today, church. What if instead of fighting against the time, what if instead of leaning headfirst into it, what if we told time differently? I want you to listen to the words of the prophet to a burdened and a weary people who were held captive to a culture of busyness and productivity. If that's not us, I don't know who is. He says, "The Lord Yahweh gives power to the faint. He strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary. Even the young will fall exhausted." And if you think about an enslaved people in Babylon producing things for this empire, you can understand why the youths are tired. The prophet continues, "But those who wait for the Lord." This is telling time differently, church. Those who wait for the Lord, they shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Waiting for the Lord is telling time differently. It is operating from the presence of God and moving from there rather than operating from our own strength, operating from our own timetables, from our own agendas, and seeing if there's a place for God to fit in there sometimes. Busyness says that I trust in myself. But waiting on the Lord is to lay aside your expectations, to put down your agendas, to put a question mark in your schedules. And from there, that is from the Lord, when we wait on the Lord, then We can run and not be weary. We can walk and not faint. When we tell time according to the Lord, when we operate from His timing, the Scriptures testify that we will not be exhausted. The last time I preached this text, church, was at the funeral of Fred Soddy. A man who wasn't fighting against the pace of the world around him, but nor was he a man burdened by it either. I don't know, maybe in 2018 the world wasn't as fast as it is today. But sitting with him in his front room watching the birds eat and flit around his bay window was sacred to him. He wasn't rushed or delayed, even in his death. One of the most sacred moments of Kayla's and my life was the death of Fred Soddy. And if I may, I would like to remember that story with you as I wrap up my sermon today. It was May. Kayla and I had traveled to Kansas City to visit her family. We got a call while we were in Kansas City that Fred had had a stroke and that his death was imminent, that he was not going to recover from the stroke. So Kayla and I, we left our vacation early. We made the decision that we were going to come back sooner than we had anticipated. And when we got to Michigan, we didn't stop off here in Hastings and unload our bags. We went right to Grand Rapids. We went right to the hospital. When we entered the hospital, we were met by his weeping children in the hallway as they welcomed us to the room. They said he's still alive, but he's laboring. His breathing is shallow. Kayla and I entered this small hospital room, and it was almost as if we had entered a time warp. In that small room, I couldn't tell you how long we were there. I don't know, it felt like a very short time, but it also felt like it lasted forever. But we entered the room and the children parted. They parted and they gave Kayla and I an avenue to see Fred, who was laying in a hospital bed. We stood next to his bed as he breathed slow, deep breaths. His eyes were closed. And we stood next to his bed. I remember I held his hand. We prayed together. We told him how much he was loved. And then we just were. We just waited. There was no agenda. There was no timetable. And it wasn't a long time, but it wasn't a short time either. However long it was, we noticed Fred's breathing start to pick up a little bit. His breathing started to get a little bit more intense, and I remember Fred opened his eyes. He opened his eyes. He lifted his head up off the bed. He looked me deep into my eyes. He mumbled something that no one but God understood. Then he laid down his head and gave up his spirit. His children were crying and sniffling. But in the midst of that moment of death, there was a peace, there was a quiet, there was a stillness, there was a sacredness to this moment. Something mysterious and sacred had occurred, and we had been invited into it. You see, Fred had been in the hospital for a few days, but he waited. He waited until Kayla and I showed up. Immediately as he passed, his children were saying to us, he needed his pastor. He was waiting for his pastor. He was waiting. He was waiting on the Lord. He was waiting for his pastor to minister to him in his moment of death. Now, there is a separate sermon about the sacred burden of being a pastor, but that's another message for another day. Instead, what I have always held dear was Fred's willingness to wait for the Lord, even in death. He wasn't fighting his death. He wasn't pushing against this change that was happening to him. But he wasn't rushing it either. He wasn't hastening it either. He wasn't in a hurry, nor was he trying to delay it. He was almost living in a different timeline. He was telling time differently. He was waiting for the Lord. I don't know who's exhausted today, but the good news is that which we read today. He gives power to the faint. He strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord will renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. And this, church, is the good news of Jesus Christ for us today.